Hello everyone, welcome to Writing 123 at Northwest Christian University. Welcome back from last week. I hope you've enjoyed, for some of you, the start to your college career. And that kind of dawned on me a little from some of your forum posts this week, that this is, for some of you, the very first college class you'll be taking, at least at this time in your lives. And I feel honored to be there with you for that, and I'm very thankful to have you, so welcome. Okay, I'm going to try to make this pretty efficient, and this isn't going to be some sort of polished presentation video, but just a down and dirty Friday night review of the week, a trajectory overview of where we're going, and a few other things. So first we're going to talk about the course trajectory, which we've talked about a little, but it's good to just get that kind of repeated and get that ingrained into our bones. And then I do want to talk about what's research. That might sound like a pretty basic question, but it was one that I certainly had when I was starting out in school. And then lastly, I want to touch some of the points that you guys brought up with the Lewis piece. So first of all, course trajectory. Here's the things you're going to turn in. Okay, we're going to be doing a lot when you're learning something in a college course. You probably are exposed to this much, okay? And then maybe this much you'll actually be assessed on. That's the way it works. So I don't apologize for this amount of reading that you might have, this amount conceptually that we might cover, but in the end, you're going to have to turn in this many things, to use my vague arm length measure. So first of all, you're going to turn in a first paper. That's going to be, as you've seen on the syllabus, writing about one film, namely The Dark Knight, in response to somebody that's already written on that film. Why are we doing that as our practice paper, as our shorter paper? Well, because that's a research paper in microcosm. Namely, you're talking about a topic or a text, which is the film. The film does certain things. It presents different images and thoughts in certain ways that different people can argue about how they ought to be interpreted, right? Well, then you're going to take an article that somebody has done that in, namely made an argument about this film, and then you are going to respond to it. It doesn't mean you're just responding only to that article and just with blinders on sort of talking about that article. And it doesn't mean that you're just kind of giving your opinion on the film. It means that you're making an argument about that film in response to some argument that somebody else has already made. We'll cover that concept a little bit more here in a second. Okay, that's the first thing you're going to turn in as far as a prepared piece. Okay, and then everything else is part of your final research paper. And I've broken that up into component parts because, as we've talked about, the more you can do that and have some structure to the work you're doing, the less daunting the overall process is going to be. So the first thing you're going to turn in, and this is weeks down the road, so if it's not helpful for you to think about it now, put it out of your mind. But I know some people are definitely planners, and they'll worry if they don't know about all the specific parts. Totally understand. So the first thing you'll turn in for your final research paper is your annotated bibliography. What's that? Well, we'll learn all about it. But what it's going to be is, here's a list of the sources or the arguments made by other people about your topic that you're going to pick. Here's the list of those that I think I'm going to use. Probably slightly more than you'll actually end up using. But then for each one, you give a little blurb. Blurb being a brief kind of summary and how you think it'll be useful to you. So for example, I'm making this up off the top of my head. Let's say your topic is aluminum cans and the way that they affect the taste of the beverage in them. Okay, our colleague down in Southern California can vibe with this topic. Well, let's say your argument is that actually the little bits of aluminum that come off of the cans make, well, you work for Anheuser-Busch, make beer taste better, and that's why Budweiser is so popular. Okay, there's your argument. Well then, so that's your argument. Let's say That's your thesis. But then you're going to find an article by Jones. And Jones says, actually, aluminum distorts the taste of anything that has hops in it, and therefore we shouldn't use aluminum cans. Okay? So what you're doing is you're making an argument about the use of cans. That's your topic. But you need to say, so you'll say, I think it makes beer taste better. However, Jones argues, see, you're bringing in this other person. Jones argues that that in fact it does the opposite, blah, blah, blah. Well, in your annotated bibliography, what you're going to do is you're going to just make a list of all those sources you found. Jones, Smith, Mr. Miyagi, etc. And they say this, this, and this. We'll get there. But that's your annotated bibliography. Basically a summary of the different things that you think you'll use in your actual paper. Okay, that's thing 2 you're going to turn in. Thing 3 is your outline. Now, an outline might sound like, well, that's a minor part of your paper to have a whole 15% of your grade on. And the reason that I do that is that the outline is so essential for making you create a clear argument. Okay, that is your roadmap. Your outline is. And if you go ahead and make that ahead of time, if you do your thinking before you start just writing and drafting, your writing and drafting will go so much faster. I'll reiterate this many times throughout this course because I've seen it time and time again. If you create a clear outline for yourself, and we'll talk about how to do that, you'll be able to write your paper very much more efficiently. But then also, besides just being more efficient, it will create a better argument because you won't get lost in the proverbial trees and lose sight of the forest. You'll be able to see that you're going from here to here to here. Aluminum cans make beer taste better. Again, this came really off the top of my head. Might not be the best illustration. That's okay. Why do I think that? Point 1, the chemical composition of aluminum, well, it's not a composition, it's an element. The chemical composition of beer reacts to aluminum in this way, blah, blah, blah. Point 1. If you write out your points really clearly, before you start writing paragraphs, everything will flow better. Your reader will be able to follow the trajectory of your argument point by point by point, and in the end, you'll be more convincing. Okay. So this is a long way to do a trajectory of the course. However, I'm previewing a lot of the concepts that are relevant to each of the parts, so that's okay. So again, 1, shorter paper where you'll be responding to only one source. Paper 1, writing about The Dark Knight, the movie, and responding to one argument about that movie. Thing 2, the annotated bibliography, where you just summarize your sources, more or less. 3, the outline that gives you the roadmap for your writing. And then finally 4 is your actual research paper. Now, if you've done all of the first 3 things well, the research paper shouldn't be, well, it'll be a good amount of work, but it should go smoothly, and you should be able to feel like you're really chugging along as you go through it. Okay, so again, that's the trajectory of the course, and we'll be working on that first little paper in the next couple weeks. And we'll be revealing more of the Beacon Learning Module course as we go as appropriate. Okay. 2. Remember I talked about, we're going to talk about 3 things today. So 2, what is research? Again, it can come across as a basic question, but a little anecdotal story. I went off, my undergraduate degree was in applied linguistics. I had never written an English paper, well, maybe 1 or 2 short ones, but I'd never taken a writing class throughout college. And so I applied and got to grad school, and I didn't really know how to write a paper. And to be honest, my very first one out of 6 or 7 years in grad school, my very first one was somewhat of a failure. And the reason was that I sat down and tried to say things about this book that I was trying to make an argument about, or I didn't even know exactly how to articulate that, like that I was trying to make an argument about the book. I felt like I had a good sort of intuitive understanding of what the book was doing. It was a novel, But when I went to write about it, it came out vague and scattered, and it didn't go well. But as I went, I began to understand what research is. And it's part of the reason that I like to use this book. See, I actually have the copy with me this time. It's about the size I said last time. This book, They Say, I Say, as a text for a writing class. And the reason is, that's what research is. It's a conversation, an ongoing conversation. And that's why this book is laid out to start with, they say. The reason that you're, making your argument, your beer can argument, is that Joan Smith and all these other people say aluminum cans are horrible for beer and we should get away from them. And you're saying, well, actually, there's a they say. There's somebody that's already said something and you're responding to it. And that's what research is. Okay? And whatever your topic is, it's not research if you just start saying what you think about it. That could be, if done well, an appropriate piece of writing, namely an opinion piece without any backing sources. But research is involving yourself in this ongoing conversation. For most topics, or most industries, or most fields, that conversation has been going on for at least decades, if not centuries. And we'll get into that more. These things we're just starting to unpack. But the second thing, what is research? Well, it's not just entering into this conversation, but it's actually saying something, having something to say, and clearly articulating that. And that might sound, again, very obvious, but actually in some ways that's one of the more difficult things for people to realize in their writing, especially if they've only kind of done writing that happens in some academic circles, not actual published academic writing, but when you go to school, high school, junior high, well, I've got to write for 3 pages, and so you kind of fill it up with things that, if you were actually talking like that to somebody at a, let's say, a dinner party, and you're standing around and making conversation, and somebody asks you what you think about something, and then you start saying, they ask you, well, who'd you vote for? You say, I think politics is an important topic, and one can see as one travels throughout the world that through all of history, politics has played an important role in mankind. People are like, what? I asked you, you get what I'm saying. In most areas of life, if you speak up, you have a reason and you end up saying something. So similarly, don't sit down and write something unless you're actually going to try and say something. I like to try to explain this to my classes in this way. Through the years that I was in college as an undergrad, I worked quite a few jobs. I got married to my, somebody who was I liked her since 8th grade, but we didn't date. Anyway, that's not really the point. But we ended up getting married junior year of college, and so I was working quite a few jobs and doing all sorts of things. Well, anyway, I was installing pool tables. That's a very labor-intensive kind of job, and we drove this van that only had AM radio that worked, and on the radio, my co-installer would always have it to the sports station, and on the sports station was Jim Rome, and I know he's on TV now. I don't know if he was then. I don't even know if he still has this show, which I don't remember what it was called. This was 10 or more years ago. But it was a call-in show. This is getting somewhere to do with research, believe it or not. It was a call-in show, and he had a tagline. He'd have the number, so he'd say 543, blah, 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 and then he'd give his tagline. Well, here's what it was. Somebody would call in, and they would say, I think the Patriots this year are just going to go downhill, whatever their thing was, and then they'd say, okay, this is Joe from Boston, I'm out, and hang up their phone. Well, the tagline that Jim Rome would use is this. Say phone number, whatever, call in, have a take, don't suck. Anyone ever hear that show? Well, let me repeat that. Have a take, don't suck. And so the first part is have a take. Don't forget that you're supposed to be saying something. When you sit down to write a research paper, what are you arguing? That's the question. What are you trying to prove? That is all you're doing in a research paper. What I should have done in that first grad school paper where I had my novel, I should have really got clear in my head. What am I trying to say about this novel? And if it was, as it was, a complex and nuanced argument, I should have sat down with it and rehashed it and crossed it out, my thesis, until I could say to myself, oh, okay, that's what I'm saying, bottom line, with all these pages of evidence. That's how I could put it into a few sentences. That's my take. And then, have a take, don't suck, as Jim Rohn would say. In our case, that means don't just say it, don't just be spouting your opinion, but bring to bear evidence. And the evidence will be either from, in the case of, for example, The Dark Knight, either from the text that you're arguing about, that's kind of a direct evidence, direct support, or working with your sources and with other people's arguments and saying, well, Smith agrees with me that aluminum enhances the flavor of wheat-based beers by bringing out the gluten molecule or whatever. The point is, you have a take, you're making an argument. Somebody could say, that's what they're saying and I disagree with it, or that's what they're saying and I agree with it. It's an arguable point. That's your take. And then not sucking involves backing that up and not just giving your opinion. So long story to say, that's what research is. 1, entering a conversation. Other people have said stuff about whatever your topic's going to be. Other people have said it for a long time. And when you're finding sources, all that is unearthing that conversation that's happened over years and decades, or however long. Unearthing that conversation, getting into the stream of it, understanding what people have said, where it's at now, and then you're going to say your thing. Not just because you want to join in, but because you have something to say. And so that's the second part, is having a take. Joining a conversation and then having something to say, supporting it, and then get out, right? Okay. So that's why I say, and pause again, I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the chair is still loud, and I'm sorry. The other chair that I have is too short. I might have been repeating myself. At any rate, so that's why I said that paper 1 is your practice for that research paper, because you don't have to do anything about finding sources. I'm giving you a choice of 3 different sources, and you're going to pick one to write in response to. And you're having a take. People have said The Dark Knight is saying this about politics or whatever, and you're saying, yes, but not exactly. It's more like this. That's your take, and then you're supporting it with quotes from the movie, descriptions of scenes from the movie. Well, when the Joker is doing this to the Batman, we know, or you can interpret that as his saying that the rule of law doesn't matter, whatever you're saying. Again, a lot of my examples will be made up so I don't steal your thunder in your papers. But that's what a research paper is. But you only have one source in this first one, which will make it easy. You pick one, and then you're going to say, McGowan, that's one of the authors, says this about The Dark Knight. I agree to some degree, but I also disagree here, and this is why. That's research, okay? And we'll try to wrap this up and putting a lot of concepts into one video in one take, and so I apologize for any roughness there. But I want to finish with C.S. Lewis. And I really appreciate the variety of students that we have in this class, the variety of ages, the variety of life situations, the variety of goals, the variety of backgrounds. And so, like I said, I have my writing classes start with this essay every year that I've taught it. There's a few reasons. One, it's a good way to kind of understand something called the rhetorical situation. That's a concept in writing that you'll do well to keep in mind. The rhetorical situation is that combination of things like author, purpose, genre, context, things that impact what actually comes out in the writing. So in the case of this C.S. Lewis essay, he originally wrote this to be a sermon, and he gave it, he read it, many sermons in the past were read. He read it as a sermon in 1939 on the cusp, in the beginnings of World War II. And he gave it, so that's one part of the rhetorical situation. There was a lot of fear. Germany was on the march. Another aspect of the rhetorical situation is that he gave it as a sermon in one of the colleges at Cambridge University. And so his audience was, there were students. And so the question at hand was very, very pertinent. And that's, as you were reading the chapters and They Say, I Say, that's how, the very first chapters, they talk about, why do you start with what they say? Isn't this my paper? Well, that gives us an exigency, a reason and an urgency for why your research, why what you're saying matters. So if you're writing a report at work, you don't start just droning on. You say, well, recently there's been this issue, here's what I found, And so similarly for C.S. Lewis, his audience were people who were entering or were at the university when World War II was starting. And so he's asking the question, is this wrong? Should I drop out of the university and go to the front lines? And Lewis was not a pacifist, and so if it were necessary, he would support that. That's not what he's getting at. What he's getting at is, why be doing something that seems so removed from the really pressing issues of life right now by going to college? Well, this is obviously relevant to all of you, and maybe even especially for all of you compared to my traditional undergraduate students who are in front of me. They're 18 and just sent off to college, and they're taking a writing class. Because you have all sorts of pressing things. Family, many of you have kids, which is great. I understand that, and most of the time, my 18-year-old, all my 18-year-old students generally don't understand that, the sort of balance that goes into getting much done in life, But you understand that there's all sorts of pressing issues. But even furthermore, and perhaps always, but it feels like we're in such a time of unrest in our country, lots of division, things like that. So why go back to college and be studying things that aren't just how to put bullets in my gun, or in your case just the most practical industry standard learning things for whatever you want to do in your career. Well, there's a couple reasons, and the first is actually the utility of learning in times like these, or in a war like that. Namely, there's one way of learning that helps you. Take the World War II example. That helps you learn the physics and the chemistry and the material science necessary to build the first atomic bomb. There's another kind of learning that forces you to decide in what circumstances it might be wise to drop that first atomic bomb, and the latter happens with more perspective, with more historical perspective, with the perspective of literature and other things like that, and understanding the reality of the human person on the other side of that bomb, and also the legal, political exigencies that might necessitate it, right? So there's a utility to it. But even more so, and the reason that I like this essay, or not just like it, but I think that it's important, is that Lewis gets at one of the crucial reasons that we ought to pursue learning as such, not just as a means to an end. And specifically as Christians, and I know we're not all Christians in this class, that's okay, but perhaps those who want to live a considered observed life, as Socrates or Plato would say. And that is the unutility of learning, namely the inherent goodness of the thing itself. That's what he really nails in this essay, I think. Namely, that we don't have to say, like, well, why, does or how does reading this novel, not just for entertainment, but some beautiful novel that challenges me to think deeply about the way the world is, and etc. Why, instead of thinking, how does that, how many souls could I save by reading this? He says that that's not as much our place, but that God is the creator of all goodness and of all truth and of all beauty. And therefore, in doing that, we're inherently entering into a good act, even if we can't add up 2 + 2 + 2 to see the utility of it. And I'll leave you with this. You're all partaking in a liberal arts education. Now, liberal means so many different things in our day and age, doesn't it? And perhaps you haven't stopped to consider, what does liberal arts mean? Well, that's what we're going to end with. What does liberal arts mean? Well, the term comes from the origins of the university in the medieval times, and it comes from the Latin artes liberales, and it means the studies or the works, not that are somehow loosey-goosey or liberal in one, or certainly not political, but the study appropriate to the free person. Okay, if you think about the word to liberate, for example, that's where the root comes from in liberalis. It's as opposed to what's the education appropriate to a slave, namely just here's how you put this cog into this, gear, and this is how you turn this thing. That's all you need to know. But for those who are freedmen, or free persons, the appropriate education is more fully orbed. You ought to know philosophy, literature, theology, science. And that's what the liberal arts meant, was understanding all the things necessary to living the good life as a free person. And so, welcome to the liberal arts if you're new to it. Namely, welcome to your university education. You're going to do great. I'm there for you all the way. Feel free to contact me at any time. Meanwhile, have a wonderful weekend. I know I'm about to. It's hailed twice here in the last half hour or so here in Eugene, Oregon. Nevertheless, I'm going to go do what I like to do on the weekend. I've got some new points in the mail. I'm putting on my motorcycle hat here. I got some new points and brake pads in the mail. And work on my bike and hopefully catch some good weather and get out there and ride around the beautiful hills of Oregon. Meanwhile, enjoy your weekends. Feel free to get a head start on next week's work. And yeah, take care. Thanks, guys.